Hi, I'm Rachel Korn from Equality Action Center at the University of California Law, San Francisco. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the research around how to write fair and effective performance evaluations. First, let's discuss how to give effective feedback using the SBI model. So here's an example to illustrate the model. We start with the situation at the team meeting last week. Next, the behavior. You seemed hesitant to hear ideas that other associates were sharing. Finally, the impact of that behavior. This made it seem like you weren't willing to hear honest feedback and that you aren't open to new solutions. So this is how your behavior had an impact on the team. And you can take it a step further by ending with an action. I encourage you to try to hear out new ideas before responding so we can get contributions from others and make sure we're drawing on everyone's expertise. This is much more effective than saying something like, you're not a good listener, because you're bringing in a specific example of a time they weren't being a good listener. You say what the real problem is, which is the impact on the team, and you give them somewhere to go from here. The takeaway here is really show your evidence, not just your conclusions. And this is helpful for two reasons. First, it provides more guidance to the candidate. So in the example we have here, it says, when we needed to reach our goal, Jim stepped up to provide support for a key project when we were short two people due to turnover, which meant we were able to deliver a high quality product on time. He was a good team player, and we would like to see him continue to be flexible and willing to tackle new projects. It seems fairer than just saying you're a good team player, because what do you mean by that? What's your evidence? So the SBI model provides more evidence for the candidate and seems fair, and it's also more helpful to others who read your evaluation because they can see what it's based on. Okay, now let's move on to interrupting bias. There are several basic patterns of bias that we see over and over again, backed up with empirical research that play out in performance evaluations. But before we move on to discussing the bias patterns, I want to highlight this study. So some of the bias patterns that we're going to discuss will be really big effects, but some may be really subtle forms of bias. And the research has shown repeatedly that even these small amounts of bias can have really large effects over time. It's kind of like compound interest, but in the opposite direction. So this is a computer simulation study. It's showing us the math. In a company, if you start out with 50-50 men and women and you build in just a 5% gender bias at each level, by the C-suite at level 8, you'll only have 2% women left. Bias plays out the same way for people of color and really any group that's facing unexamined bias in small, everyday ways. And that's exactly what Equality Action Center research finds too. The differences in everyday experiences may be small, but they can add up to be career defining. The first pattern of bias we'll discuss is what we call feedback bias. Who gets paid feedback and who gets honest feedback? Now, one study of performance evaluations shows that women tend to get vague praise. About 57% of women get vague praise, but only 43% of men do. That may not seem like a hugely important differential, but remember, we just saw that graphic that tells us that even 5% adds up over time. Another study shows that women tend to get what the researchers called little white lies about their performance, a lack of honest feedback. But the problem with this is that these women don't get a chance to improve. If you're always told that you're doing well, even when you aren't, you're going to keep performing at the same level and never have a chance to learn and grow. Here's another study of gender bias in performance evaluations in a tech company. It found that men tend to get developmental feedback linked to business outcomes. 60% of men got that kind of feedback, but only 40% of women. And here's a quote for this kind of developmental feedback from the law firm that we worked with. She should keep developing her expertise on the client side and start delegating more work to these two associates so she can help train them and learn how to manage. So you can see how it's better to give guidance that's super concrete. It's going to make that person better at their job rather than some vague comment that might be complimentary but is devoid of feedback that's really critical to skill development. Okay, one reason why it's so important to give high quality feedback is that people who get low quality feedback are much more likely to leave their roles than those who don't. Among people who got high quality feedback, 22% plan to leave, compared to 40% among people who got low quality feedback. It doesn't matter whether the feedback is positive or critical in nature. If it's low quality, it drives people's desire to look for new roles. And in fact, this report shows that when we isolate other causes of attrition in the data, 10% of all employee attrition is typically caused by low quality feedback. High quality feedback also helps retention. Among people planning to stay at their organizations, 61% agree that they understand what their manager expects them to demonstrate in order to earn their next promotion. Among people planning to leave their organizations, only 21% do. Okay, the second form of bias we'll cover is what we call prove it again. Some groups have to prove themselves more than others. But the reason why this happens is well documented. Research shows that some groups, men in particular, are often judged on their potential, whereas others, like women and people of color, are judged on their performance. A recent study at a large retail chain found that women received lower potential ratings despite getting higher performance ratings than men. And up to 50% of the gender differential in promotions was actually attributable to those potential ratings. But here's the kicker. Potential ratings do not provide an accurate forecast for the future. Women who got the same potential ratings as men outperformed them. So when it comes to high-profile assignments and promotions, this might mean that men might be getting an advantage because they might be judged on potential rather than what they've already achieved, whereas women have to have all of the same achievements and then some. So we do see those differences in evaluation content as well. Some groups have the advantage of being judged on potential, whereas others are judged on their performance. And here's why this is unfair. If you're being rated on your potential, you're getting a lot more wiggle room. What have you accomplished? What might you accomplish in the year ahead? What traits do I attribute to you that might help you succeed? There are a lot more pathways to success when I'm looking at your potential, because if you're being rated on performance, I'm examining concretely what you've already done. So what you've accomplished in a set time period, which means I'm really evaluating you within the set limits of what you actually achieved. So it's unfair to evaluate one group based on their actual achieved performance and the other on their potential, because it's a lot easier to imagine a bright future than to provide actual evidence of accomplishments. Another aspect of prove it again bias is leniency bias. You would think that objective rules would be a guarantee of objectivity, but that's not the case. Research shows that objective rules are applied rigorously to some groups, but others get benefit of the doubt. This effect is best illustrated by another famous study where researchers sent a memo to law firm partners with 7 grammatical and spelling mistakes. They found that the partners noticed more mistakes if the memo had an African American sounding name at the top. So if it was Jamal, the partners noticed an average of 5.8 mistakes. If it was Greg, they only noticed 2.9 mistakes. At the same time, 74% of Black male lawyers report that their work gets more scrutiny, and 2/3 report that they've been called an affirmative action hire, which is a really contemporary form of the prove it again effect. Now that we understand how prove it again bias plays out in evaluations, let's talk about ways to interrupt it. The first, stick to performance. Make sure that you're rating everyone on their performance with specific examples of how they met the relevant competencies. Don't waive established requirements, or if you do, watch out for patterns. If you're giving some people a pass on requirements like client development or mentoring junior colleagues, it creates a system that's inherently more difficult for some groups. Limit your comments to the evaluation period. This means focus on the last 12 months of deliverables, goals, and achievements. Avoid global judgments without backup. So this could sound like, she's emotional. If this is real feedback, provide specific examples of when and how the person has been showing up this way and why this is job relevant. And finally, discuss specific skills and give concrete examples for all ratings, both strengths and opportunities. Okay, the second common form of bias in performance evaluations is called tightrope bias. It stems on the gender front from prescriptive stereotypes. So these are traits that someone should have or that are desirable for somebody to possess. If you ask people to describe a good woman, they say things like nice, feminine, warm and kind, patient, attentive to their appearance, and polite. So someone who's a good team player. But if you ask people about a good man, they say really different things. They expect a good man to be competent, self-reliant, ambitious, masculine, decisive, and assertive. Basically, somebody who has all the qualities of a leader. You might have noticed there's a tightrope here. Women have to behave in masculine ways in order to be seen as competent leaders, but at the same time, women are expected to be feminine. And the research shows this as well. In an analysis of a Wall Street firm, warmth mattered more for women than for men. So women who were seen as not being warm were hindered from getting higher ratings even when they had high technical competence. So that warm personality is super important for women, but it's actually optional for men. Here's another study that found that when women lead, they're called abrasive, strident, and aggressive. When women object, their behaviors are described as emotional and irrational. In a 2016 performance evaluation study, in comments that used the word aggressive, 76% were about women and only 24% were about men. The overall message is that personality comments are super common in evaluations, but they usually aren't applied fairly to all groups. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you're writing evaluations. Now, sometimes we hear pushback about this, particularly when we're talking about client-facing roles, because of course, it is possible that someone has a personality problem that needs to be addressed. But the important thing to think about is whether this is an issue that would be a problem for anybody, or if you're holding some groups to different standards. For example, one thing that might come up in an evaluation is she's so shy. And maybe that does need to be addressed, but instead of just saying the associate is shy, we could say, I've noticed you're really quiet during meetings and would love to leverage your expertise more. How can we help you speak up? So using that framework to address the behavior rather than a personality trait. Another common tightrope pattern we see in evaluations is regarding who's seen as a leader versus who's expected to be a good team player. Someone who's seen as a leader is more likely to have opportunities for those high-quality, career-enhancing assignments that are necessary to get promoted. Now, this is a survey from an industry-wide study of lawyers conducted by Equality Action Center, and we saw that white men were much more likely than other groups to report having access to that career-enhancing, high-profile work. And on the flip side, somebody who's seen as a team player should probably be available to take on all of those tasks at work that are necessary but don't really add to your career or promotion prospects, the office housework. And what we see is that women of all races, but Black, Latina, and other historically excluded women in particular, are more likely to be praised for doing the office housework in their evaluations. Now, a quote that illustrates what this office housework looks like in evaluations is here. She continues to build a positive environment in the team by planning events and volunteering to make videos for teammates' baby showers. Now, this is good and important team building at work, but when it's distributed unevenly, it means that women either have to spend more time at work because they're doing that career enhancing work, or else they're doing it instead of the career enhancing work, which means they aren't doing that work that they need to do to advance. And at some organizations, the office housework might include that kind of party planning or administrative work, like taking notes in meetings, which makes it harder to participate. But it can also include undervalued work, like we saw in this evaluation. This associate was tasked with creating and organizing out-of-office activities for the summer clerks. She has done a remarkable job arranging sporting events, zoo visits, and happy hours. The summer clerks have responded favorably. So she's being praised for this, but it's a very different kind of content than we typically see in men's evaluations. So some key tightrope bias interrupters are: don't ding women as not being team players for pushing back against administrative work. Consider whether that work is being allocated fairly and make sure that it is. And ensure fair access to that career enhancing work so that everybody has a chance to do that high profile work that's appropriate for their level. Treat personality comments with care. Just run it through your head another time to see if you would consider it an issue if it was somebody from a different group. And watch out to make sure you're not relying on stereotypes in evaluations. So our final takeaway is, remember, small positive changes to performance evaluations can add up to career-defining impacts over time. If you want more resources, check out biasinterrupters.org for tools to improve your performance evaluations, recruitment, meetings, and more.